My name is Margot Evelyn Barron. I'm 70 years old, though I only started feeling my age the day my husband, Raymond, took his last breath beside me. We had shared nearly 5 decades together, on the land, in the soil, through storms and sunshine, growing barren hollow vineyards into something that outlived droughts, market crashes, and even our own disagreements. The vines were our children long before Colin was ever born. Each bottle held a season of our lives, and when he died, I thought that part of my story might end too. Raymond passed in his sleep, peacefully after years of coughing through the nights and stubbornly refusing oxygen tanks. The man hated weakness, but more than that, he hated pity, and so when he went quietly. I wore black to his funeral, not because it was tradition, but because it felt like the only armor I had left. The ceremony was simple, as he would have wanted. No speeches, no show, just a crisp wooden casket, a hill overlooking our vineyard, and a breeze that carried the scent of ripe muscadines. Friends came, neighbors came. Even a few retired workers showed up with worn hands and damp eyes. But Colin and his wife, Megan, arrived like visiting executives at a boardroom funeral, detached, impeccably dressed, and 3 hours late due to a delayed flight from San Diego. They barely looked at the rows of vines we'd spent our lives tending. Didn't even stay for the meal afterward. I had hoped they'd come to mourn, but instead they came to negotiate. On the second morning after the burial, I found Colin seated at Raymond's old desk. The chair creaked under him, just as it always had. But it sounded wrong, like it knew someone else was sitting in it. He looked up from a folder of printed spreadsheets and smiled in that overly rehearsed way of his. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about the future of Barren Hollow." Megan was standing by the window, arms folded, staring out at the vineyard like it was a bad investment property. She didn't even look at me. "I've been thinking," Colin continued. "With Dad gone, you shouldn't be out there every day. It's too much for you. We could help ease the burden. Maybe take over operations, bring in some partners, modernize the place, maybe even sell part of the land while the market's still strong." There it was. Barely 72 hours since we buried Raymond, and already they were talking about carving up the legacy we'd built. My fingers clenched around the back of the kitchen chair. "Ease the burden?" I said slowly. "Is that what you think this is? A burden?" Colin's voice softened, like he was talking to a child. "I just think it's time to look at this realistically. You're not getting any younger, and the estate, well, if we're being honest, it needs new direction." That word, estate, not home, not vineyard, not even business, just estate. Cold, clinical, like something waiting to be split, sold, and buried. I didn't say anything then. I simply walked out. I went to the western field where Raymond and I first planted the Syrah vines the year after Colin was born. I touched the soil with my bare hands and remembered the way Raymond used to laugh at me for not wearing gloves. He said the vines could feel us better that way. That night, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling fan spin above me, thinking about every time I had missed a holiday with Colin because of harvest, every soccer game I watched through the window while bottling late, every compromise we made to keep this land alive. I realized something painful. They didn't see the vineyard as a legacy. They saw it as leverage. The next morning, I called my lawyer. What Colin didn't know was that after Raymond's diagnosis, we had quietly adjusted our estate plan. Raymond may have left me alone in this world, but he did not leave me unarmed. Ownership of the vineyard was transferred entirely to my name. Every acre, every barn, every vine. I wasn't just the grieving widow. I was the sole proprietor. So when Colin brought up the investment group again 2 days later, I slid a folder across the table, one with all the legal documents he hadn't seen. "You don't own any of this," I told him calmly, "and you never will. You're welcome to stay for dinner. But after that, I think it's best if you go." Megan's mouth fell open. Colin's face turned the color of Cabernet. "I'm your son," he said quietly. "You were," I replied. "But now, you're just someone who came to divide what he never helped build." He left in silence. I watched their rental car roll down the gravel path and vanish around the bend. I haven't heard from him since. Now I wake up early again. The harvest is smaller without Raymond, but it's honest. The workers still call me Miss Barron, and the vines still know my hands. I eat my lunch under the same oak tree we planted on our 5th anniversary. Raymond may be gone, but I am not done. Because the funeral wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The morning after the funeral, the house still smelled like lilies and wood polish. I hadn't even finished my tea when Colin placed a stack of neatly bound documents on the breakfast table. He did it the way a manager slides a contract across a desk. Polite, firm, rehearsed. "Mom," he said, his voice wrapped in false warmth. "Dad wanted me to take over the business. He told me during our last call." Megan sat beside him, her hands folded, nodding like this had already been agreed upon, like I'd somehow missed a memo about my own life. I stared at the stack, my spoon frozen mid-air over a bowl of oatmeal gone cold. "There's already a will," I said slowly. "Mr. Halverson has it. It was updated 5 years ago when we refinanced the South Field." Colin didn't flinch. "There's a newer one. Dad signed it last year. This one gives me full operational control of Barron Hollow, the vineyard, the distribution rights, even the staff." I reached for the papers with a steady hand, though my heart had started to hammer. The signature at the bottom of the top page was too clean, too deliberate. I remembered how Raymond's hands had trembled after just climbing the stairs. Toward the end, he couldn't even hold a coffee cup without help. And yet, here was a bold, unshaking signature. It didn't smell right. "I'll need to have Mr. Halverson look this over," I said, carefully sliding the pages into a folder. "If it's legitimate, then he'll verify it." Colin's jaw tightened. "Mom, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do what's best for you. This place is too much. Too many acres. Too much work. It's not sustainable for someone your age." I wanted to laugh at the irony of it. Too much work? I had spent 40 years bottling wine with my bare hands, climbing ladders, training new hires, and managing payroll through harvest droughts. I had patched irrigation pipes in the dark and driven forklifts when delivery drivers didn't show. This place wasn't too much for me. It was part of my body, my breath. Then Megan spoke, with a cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. "We've actually arranged a private tour at the Pines at Emerald Hills. It's a luxury retirement community in Denver. There's yoga and spa days and even weekly wine tastings. You'll love it, Margot. It's peaceful." Peaceful. That's what they called exile now. I said nothing. Not then. I just stared at the swirling steam rising from my tea. But inside, something old and quiet had stirred. A deep-rooted strength, the kind you don't notice until someone tries to dig it out. They had forgotten something vital about me. I wasn't just Raymond's wife. I was half the reason Barron Hollow still stood. Later that day, I called Mr. Halverson. He came to the house with a briefcase and a skeptical frown. When I handed him the so-called updated will, he scanned the pages silently, then tapped the signature line with his pen. "This doesn't match the records," he muttered. "Raymond hadn't signed anything in months, let alone something this formal. And operational control? That was never in discussion with me." I nodded, already knowing what he would say next. "Margot," he said, lowering his voice, "I think this is worth investigating formally." By the time Colin returned from his afternoon walk around the vineyard, which I suspected was more of a property assessment than a stroll, Mr. Halverson had already taken the documents and promised to contact a handwriting specialist. That evening, I made myself a glass of Cabernet and walked down the rows of Syrah vines. The sun was setting in that familiar, golden way that made the land look painted. I stopped by the old bench Raymond built with his own hands and sat quietly. They thought I would bend. that I'd shuffle off to Denver with a silk robe and cucumber water while they sliced up my life and sold it by the acre. But I wasn't going anywhere. Let them tour retirement communities and fantasize about easy takeovers. Let them think I was some tired old widow ready to hand over keys. Because what they didn't realize is this: I am the roots of this vineyard, and I'm not done growing. The morning air smelled like dust and cold steel when Colin said, "Let's go for a drive, Mom." He was unusually chipper for someone who'd spent the past 2 days trying to annex my life like a hostile takeover. I glanced at Megan, who gave me that tight-lipped smile she always used when she wanted me to feel grateful for something I didn't ask for. "A drive might do us all some good," she added, reaching for her designer sunglasses. I nodded, saying nothing. Inside, I already knew something was off. The kind of silence Colin carried that morning wasn't reflective. It was calculated. Still, I played along. I dressed in quiet clothes and packed a second bag, small, sturdy, unassuming. It held my wallet, a few prescription bottles, and one document that neither of them knew I had: the original deed to Barron Hollow, signed and notarized in 1978. We drove for nearly 40 minutes, passing fields of soy and corn, the occasional silo looming like an old soldier still standing watch. At first, I thought maybe they were taking me to the retirement community they'd been so eager to pitch. But the road grew narrower, the houses more distant, the land more forgotten. Finally, Colin pulled off near a field outside Mount Kearney. No buildings, no signage, just dirt, wind, and the sound of the engine ticking in the cold. "This is where you get off, Mom," he said. At first I laughed. Sharp, involuntary, the way you do when someone says something so absurd it feels like a bad joke. But then I saw his face. He wasn't joking. "What are you talking about?" I asked, turning to Megan for confirmation. Her eyes didn't meet mine. "We left some of your things in the trunk," she said, her voice calm and professional, like a hotel receptionist checking me out early. "There's a diner a few miles up the road. They've got good pie, I hear." She said it like I was being dropped off for a lunch date, not like I was being abandoned in a dusty stretch of nowhere by my only son. Colin stepped out, opened the trunk, and pulled out a single floral suitcase, one I hadn't used in years, the wrong one. It had a busted zipper and a torn lining. Inside, I would later find nothing but some outdated sweaters and a half-used bottle of shampoo. "I don't understand," I said, still trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, still reaching for a thread of logic. Colin's expression didn't change. "Mom, you've made it clear you don't want to cooperate. You've stalled the will. You won't sign over the transfer papers. We're just removing obstacles. It's time to move on. For everyone." Then they drove off. No dramatic goodbye, no backward glance, just the crunch of tires over gravel, and then silence. I stood there for a long moment, the suitcase beside me like a punchline. The wind tugged at my sleeves, and the vastness of the empty field made me feel small. Briefly, but only briefly. Because what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I had already packed a second bag that morning. A real one. And more importantly, I had the deed. Not a copy, not a scanned version. The original, signed by Raymond Barron and me on a spring afternoon when the vineyard was nothing but a dream and a few rows of stubborn Syrah. It named me as joint owner. And thanks to Raymond's trust in the end, it gave me full authority. And they had just made a critical mistake. They left me standing. They thought abandonment would humiliate me into submission, that I'd crawl back, tail tucked, begging for a seat at the table of my own legacy. But they didn't realize who they were dealing with. After a few minutes, I pulled out my phone, thankfully still charged, and called a car service. While I waited, I sat on my suitcase and watched the horizon like it was a challenge. The sky was wide and wild, just like the years I spent building my life from scratch. By nightfall, I was back in Hazelbrook, sipping tea in my kitchen, the house warm and lit. the vineyard outside wrapped in shadows and memory. The next morning, I contacted Mr. Halverson. I told him everything. He was horrified, but not surprised. "Colin's updated will won't hold," he assured me. "It's fraudulent. And what they did, leaving you out there, could have legal consequences." I smiled, not because I wanted revenge, not yet, but because I finally had clarity. For years, I had justified Colin's distance, his ambition, his coldness. I told myself it was the stress of the city, the demands of his career, the influence of Megan. But now I saw the truth. It wasn't that he changed. It's that he'd stopped seeing me as his mother. He saw me as an obstacle to remove. And now he was about to learn something important. You don't erase people like me. You underestimate women like me at your peril. Because I don't just remember where the roots were planted, I am the roots. And I still own the ground beneath his feet. It's funny how the things we tuck away just in case end up saving our lives. Before Raymond and I were even married, I bought 15 acres of land adjacent to what would later become barren, hollow vineyards. It wasn't grand or especially picturesque back then, just raw, dusty hills with a grove of stunted oak and one stubborn, unassuming well. But I paid for it in full under my maiden name, Margot Evelyn Clark. Raymond called it our just-in-case land. He always said every empire needs a secret gate. And I suppose that's exactly what it became. You see, those 15 acres held something precious, the only natural well that fed the irrigation lines across the entire vineyard. Without that water source, the vines would wither. No water meant no grapes, and no grapes meant no barren hollow wine, no contracts, no legacy. Just a dry husk of what used to be. That well was the heartbeat of our operation. And the best part? Colin and Megan didn't even know it existed. They were too busy looking at spreadsheets and market forecasts to understand how vineyards truly survive. They thought control came with paper. I knew it came from the ground. So, the morning after Colin and Megan left me on the side of the road like discarded luggage, I laced up the same loafers I wore to Raymond's funeral, grabbed my real bag, the one with the deed, and walked 6 miles to Bailey's Supply and Feed. I knew the owners there, and thankfully, they still knew me. Mrs. Bailey didn't ask many questions. She just handed me a glass of water and pointed to the phone in the back. I called Mr. Halverson from the old landline, my fingers trembling, not from fear, but adrenaline. He picked up on the second ring. "Margot," he said, "are you all right? Where are you?" "I'm fine," I said, "and I have something you need to see. That will Colin showed me. It's not on file, is it?" There was a pause. "No," he said slowly. "It's not. The last will I have from Raymond is dated 4 years ago. It lists you as sole executor and heir to all operations. What did Colin give you?" "A forgery," I replied. "I'm almost certain of it. Probably made by Megan's brother. He dabbles in cybersecurity, remember? He helped them with the website redesign last year." Halverson let out a sharp breath. "Bring everything to my office today." I did just that. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting across from him, the deed to the just-in-case land in one hand and a copy of the forged will in the other. He examined both with a lawyer's eye and a family friend's disbelief. "You realize what this means, don't you?" he said. I nodded. "They tried to steal the vineyard." He leaned back in his chair, and they failed. That night, I stayed at the house of an old friend, Carolyn, who used to manage harvest scheduling with me before she retired to town. She fed me stew and listened while I told her the entire story. I didn't cry, not once. I think I had done all my grieving at Raymond's bedside, long before the funeral. What I felt now wasn't sadness. It was resolve. The next morning, Mr. Halverson filed an injunction to block any sale, restructure, or transfer of Barren Hollow assets until a full investigation could be completed. That included a cease and desist order on all business accounts Colin had attempted to access. He wasn't just cut off. He was legally removed from touching anything tied to the vineyard. And as for the just-in-case land, I had it officially linked into the vineyard's operating agreement as a critical asset. Meaning, without my signature, not a single legal transaction involving Barren Hollow could move forward. That little well? Suddenly it was the lock on the whole vault. A week later, Colin called. I let it go to voicemail. Then he texted. Then Megan emailed. Then came the legal threats, thinly veiled, full of bluster. But I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I hosted the spring tasting event. Alone. I stood under the big oak tree where Raymond once played banjo on warm evenings, and I poured Cabernet for our oldest supporters. People asked about Colin. I told them he was pursuing other ventures. And then I smiled, because now, finally, the vineyard was safe. Because they had forgotten the land. They had forgotten me. And they had forgotten one simple truth. When you try to bury a woman like me, you better be sure she's not a seed. By the next afternoon, Mr. Halverson moved faster than I'd ever seen him in all our years of working together. With the original deed in hand and the forged will now part of an active investigation, he filed an emergency injunction against any pending business deals involving Barren Hollow. He moved with the precision of a man who understood not just the law, but legacy. That same day, a notice was delivered to Summit Equity Group, the sleek, shark-toothed developer Colin had been whispering with behind my back. They were planning a $5 million redevelopment deal, turning our vineyard into a luxury eco-resort experience with a tasting room, infinity pool, and a helipad, if you can believe it. But here's the thing. No water rights, no deal. You can't grow grapes or luxury anything without water. And the well on that 15-acre parcel, the one Colin didn't even know existed, wasn't included in any of his glossy presentations or digital brochures. The moment Summit's legal team received the injunction and the updated land report, the deal crumbled like stale biscotti. I imagine it hit Colin like a bucket of cold wine. He called me the next evening. I watched the phone ring from my spot on the back porch, rocking slowly with a cup of peppermint tea in hand. The caller ID lit up with his name, Colin B., and for a second, I wondered what I would hear if I answered. A scream? An apology? A lawyer breathing heavily through speakerphone? I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. 5 minutes later, Megan texted. Her words were clipped, frantic and full of unspoken fear. Please talk to us. We didn't know about the other land. We can still figure this out. I stared at the screen, the glow of it dim against the twilight. Still figure this out. There was no, I'm sorry. No, we were wrong. No, we should never have done this to you. Just panic. Just strategy. They weren't sorry for trying to steal what I'd built with my bare hands. They were sorry it didn't work. I placed the phone face down on the patio table and looked out at the vineyard, which shimmered under the last strands of daylight like it was exhaling. The vines didn't care about deals or lawsuits. They only cared about water and time and hands that knew how to tend them. Raymond and I had built Barren Hollow not just with grit, but with love. Love that didn't wear suits or draft proposals. Love that lived in blisters and sunburns and wine-stained fingernails. That kind of love doesn't die easy. I didn't respond to the text. I didn't need to, because they already knew the answer. They knew when the deal collapsed. They knew when the legal cease and desist arrived at their rented condo's doorstep. They knew when Halverson's firm followed up with a formal petition for fraud investigation. They knew when the local paper published a brief piece titled "Matriarch Blocks Vineyard Takeover Amid Legal Battle." They knew finally that I hadn't been some grieving widow waiting to be quietly ushered away. I was the one holding the deed, the water, the land, the legacy. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. I spent them walking the rows, checking the vines, and reintroducing myself to the work I loved. I met with the farmhands and told them the truth, not the tabloid version, the real version, that we were still standing. That Barren Hollow would remain in the family, not just by blood, but by honor. Because blood alone doesn't make someone family. Loyalty does. And they had none. I didn't hear from Colin or Megan again that week, but I didn't need to. The silence told me everything I needed to know. And the land? The land stayed mine. After everything settled, after the injunctions, the silence, the stinging realization that my own flesh and blood saw me as an obstacle, I found myself exactly where I needed to be. Above the old bakery in Maple Grove, in a modest one-bedroom rental that smelled like cinnamon rolls every morning and fresh bread by noon. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was simply enduring. I felt like I was living. I began offering small tours of the vineyard, not the kind you book online with glossy brochures and themed wine pairings. No, these were slow, muddy, hands-in-the-soil kinds of tours. Mostly for young farmers, kids in their 20s and 30s who wanted to learn how to work with the land instead of against it. I taught them about dry farming, about trusting the weather and the soil, about grafting vines with your own hands instead of outsourcing to machines. I didn't just rebuild Barren Hollow, I shared it. I opened the doors Raymond and I once kept closed and watched new roots take hold, not just in the vineyard, but in people. And I felt something return to me that I hadn't realized I'd lost. Purpose. As for that quiet, overlooked stretch of land, the 15 acres I'd bought under my maiden name so long ago, I made a decision. I placed it in a conservation trust, permanently protected, legally untouchable. That well would never feed anyone's luxury resort. That soil would never be paved over for parking lots or spa pools. That land, like the life I had reclaimed, would remain wild and pure and free. And Colin? Colin and Megan didn't just lose money. They lost credibility. Summit Equity turned on them fast when the deal collapsed. The company filed a civil suit for misrepresentation and fraudulent documentation. Apparently, investors don't take kindly to being duped. Their names were quietly scrubbed from the real estate board directories. Megan's brother, who had likely helped forge the will, lost his consulting license after a digital forensics report linked him to the modified documents. I didn't need revenge. The truth did the work for me. People sometimes ask if I've forgiven them. I always give the same answer. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I can forgive the storm, but I won't hand it the matches next time. I still haven't spoken to Colin. He hasn't come back, hasn't called again, and honestly, I'm okay with that. There's a strange kind of peace in letting go of the version of someone you hoped they would be, and learning to live without the ache of waiting for them to become it. These days, I walk through the vineyard every morning with a mug of black coffee in one hand and pruning shears in the other. I wear a wide-brimmed straw hat that once belonged to Raymond and a denim jacket patched so many times it could tell its own story. The vines know me, the land knows me, and I've come to know myself again, too. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a woman who needed to prove her worth. Just as Margot. A woman who stood her ground, literally. A woman who lost everything, then realized what mattered couldn't be stolen. Because the kind of peace I carry now, you don't buy it, you earn it. And I did, 1 acre at a time, one morning at a time, one truth at a time. Looking back now with the vineyard quiet under the early morning mist and a lifetime of memory folded into the soil, I can say this with honesty. I don't hate them, but I don't forgive them either. Not because I can't, but because they never asked for it. Forgiveness, true forgiveness, requires more than silence. It demands ownership, an apology, a moment of truth, and they never gave me one. Not Colin, not Megan, not even when everything fell apart and the world saw them for what they were, opportunists dressed in family titles. They saw my age and my grief as weakness, a door left ajar, a window they could slip through. But what they forgot, what people often forget when they only look with modern eyes, is this. Before I was a mother, before I was a wife, before I was anyone's anything, I was a woman who built something from nothing, a woman who knew the weight of a shovel, the ache of early frost, and the joy of bloom after drought. A woman who could read the land like a story and knew exactly when to cut and when to wait. I was and am someone who created a legacy, not with shortcuts or schemes, but with hands that blistered and healed and blistered again. And I never needed to shout to be heard. That was the part they misunderstood the most. They thought power came from noise, from speed, from pushing papers and pushing people. But real strength, real power is quiet. It's rooted. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. I've learned something else, too. If you've ever been cast aside, if you've ever been quietly betrayed without slander or spectacle, just a slow erosion of trust, if someone has tried to rewrite your worth behind your back or subtract you from your own story, let me tell you this, you don't need revenge to win. You don't need to out-scheme them, outspeak them, or outmaneuver their petty manipulations. You just need to know who you are and never let anyone take that from you, because the truth has a way of blooming through even the hardest soil. And legacy isn't what people say about you in headlines or obituaries. It's what still stands when they're gone. For me, it's the rows of vines I walk each morning. It's the soil beneath my feet that knows every version of who I've been. It's the land that remembers me when others choose to forget. And that, quietly, steadily, is enough. I am Margot Evelyn Barron, and I am still here.